Hello, everybody. This is Bertha Lewis from the Black Institute. We're here for our continuing series of real, raw raps about race and everything else. I was just at a press conference, so I got to take my gear off. But welcome, everyone. So, let me just give you a little bit of background on the Black Institute for those of you who may not know who we are. The Black Institute was founded in 2010. As some of you may know, I was the director of ACORN. And after we reorganized ACORN, we wanted to know, what should I do? And I just felt as though since this country was moving towards a minority country, that somebody ought to make sure that there was an action tank, a think tank that takes action, and that would operate with data, research, and partnering with other universities and colleges. But that's our head strategy, and you always have to bring it down to the heart and make it plain, as Malcolm X would say, and turn that into legislation or policy or even training. But even though you have the head and you bring it to the heart, nothing moves without the feet. And so part of what we do, and we put the action in action tank, think tank that takes action, is on the ground grassroots organizing. Now, we have 3 issue buckets. The environment, as I said, I just left a press conference about the environment. Immigration, definitely, from an of-color and Black point of view, economics, and education. But this we're doing around our immigration bucket as a series of talks with Black folks, Latinos, and tonight we're having an all Asian panel. So part of what we want to do, like you saw when this first came up, we have published 2 volumes of books called All Races and All Faces. And one of the projects that we do in our immigration bucket is what we call the G Project. And G stands for generation. You know, we could call ourselves African Americans, Caribbean Americans, you know, what other kind of Americans, but what is our generation? If you're an OG, that means you were born outside the country, you're an original G. A G1, first generation, G2, second generation. And so, as part of our G project, this is why we do these real, raw race roundtables. So, let's get started. I want to introduce each one of our panelists individually, and they'll just say hi and tell you a little bit about themselves. The first panelist is Seon Wong, and she's a community activist and a visual artist. She was born in China, but raised in New York City. And Seon is a first generation. She's a G1 immigrant. She acquired her art fundamentals at LaGuardia High School of Music and Art and Performing Arts, though she went on to study history and economics in college and then attended law school, some of the same paths all of us have taken. She always took art classes alongside her academic studies. And in 2000, she began working as a workers' rights lawyer. But she continued her art studies with each semester and weekend classes, you know, at various places, including the Art Student League. And since 2018, Seon has shown her paintings at the Equity Gallery of New York Artists Equity Association, New York Art Center, and has spoken about her art at the Asian Society in New York, the Museum of Chinese in the Americas, and other venues. As a workers' rights lawyer, however, because it still stays with her, her contact with everyday working people informs her empathy and artistic vision, but her immigrant roots and her encounters as an Asian American woman in America illuminate her visual interests. Her work was supported by the Asian Women Giving Circle and the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council. How you doing, Seon? Say hi to everybody. Oh, you gotta unmute yourself.
Hi, everybody. Nice to see you here. Thank you for having me.
Good, good. Our next panelist is Jaya Chong. She's the executive director of Mekong NYC. Born in Cambodia during the fall of the Khmer Rouge, Jaya spent much of her young life moving through refugee camps before arriving in the Bronx. Now, from a young age, she's been focused on doing as much as she could to help her community grow in this new home, starting as a tutor at 16 at COB, one of the first organizations in America to mobilize Asian immigrant communities. Now, Jaya was beginning a path that would lead her to becoming the director of COB's Youth Leadership Project, taking on slumlords, overcrowded classrooms, and cutbacks in translation services at public assistance centers and local health clinics. This movement was built around a group of young immigrants that had lost much of their families and their heritage to the Khmer Rouge and have stepped in to fight against the systemic oppression that faces all impoverished groups. In 2012, Jaya co-founded Mekong NYC, a community-based organization in the Bronx, empowering the Cambodian and Vietnamese community through arts, culture, community organizing, and advocacy. She is currently the executive director of Mekong NYC, and she is also a mother of 3, and their ages are 13, 9, and 4. Woo! You go, Jaya. Say hi to everybody.
Hi, everyone. And that's probably old bio because my daughter is 21 to be 21. My son is going to be 17 and my youngest is going to be 12. So I'm glad to be joining you all tonight, but I have a grown daughter, more than grown. So thank you for saying my name so beautifully as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you for being here. Now, our next panelist is Stephen Lee, and he's an NYPD sergeant. Stephen is a native New Yorker, first generation of G1, Asian American, and a father of a wonderful teenage daughter and son on the way. Born in Brooklyn, Flatbush, I live in Flatbush, and later raised in Queens to 2 immigrant parents, Stephen cherished the wonderful opportunity to grow up in Flushing, Queens, one of the most diverse communities in the world. Growing up in Flushing, Stephen was able to see many people succeed and realize their American dream, though he also faced many obstacles due to his minority status. Stephen realized his childhood dream of becoming a member of the New York City Police Department in January of 2006. But in 2013, Stephen was proudly promoted to the rank of sergeant within the NYPD and transferred to the 109th Precinct, which serves the northeast portion of Queens, including downtown Flushing. Shortly after his promotion, however, in 2014-2015, Sergeant Stephen Lee discovered widespread corruption that was poisoning the police department in his community. In his role as sergeant, Stephen led the effort to uncover and fight the corruption he discovered, which resulted in the arrest of multiple police officials who violated public trust. He worked collaboratively with investigators to make these abuses public, and Stephen still proudly works in the NYPD to fight corruption and to protect the people he swore to serve. Hi, Stephen. Say hi to everybody.
Hi, everybody. My son is born now. He's 6 months.
Great.
Yeah, and continuing fighting the systematic corruption inside NYPD, and I hope I can make a difference for everybody.
Good. We
Thanks.
need you. We need
Thank
you.
you.
Our next panelist is Don Lee. Now, Don is chairman of Homecrest Community Services. Now, he's a proven executive with an established track record in customer-centric leadership, success, and mission alignment in both public and private sectors. An information technology expert with broad and deep knowledge and 25 plus years in IT design, strategy, application development, innovation, and implementation. He's a well-connected influencer, just so you people know, with decades of experience engaging senior levels of government, corporate leaders, media, and community relations. Creative solutions, solutions-based leader with sharp instincts. He's creative and consistent ability to make timely, informed decisions through input, market feedback, and most of all, common sense, which we all know ain't very common. How you doing, Don?
Hi, Ms. Lewis, Bertha. Thank you so much for having me here.
Okay. And last, but certainly not least, Ademe Turgodeyeva. She is a campaign field director, born and raised in Kazakhstan and raised in Dubai and the US. Ademe is truly a citizen of the world, having studied in both Russia and now she's at our own Hunter College. Ademe has used both her experience and heritage to make her one of the youngest field directors for a city council race, working with Bridget Rain, who's running for city council, isn't everybody? Since moving to New York, Ademe has witnessed much of the great history and culture that thrives in a city such as New York, but has also dealt with much of the same hate and prejudice that faces Asian Americans on a daily basis, even as the Census Bureau does not consider her to be quote unquote Asian. So let's get to it and let's talk about it, panel. All right, let's just start out boom, straight in. Asian American. Let's talk about that term. And I'm just going to go around as you appear on the screen to begin this, but we want this to be a discussion. First question, do you think that Asian American is a useful or accurate term? Do you and the people within your community actually talk about themselves and say, I'm Asian American? And from each one of you, let's hear a little bit about the diversity of Asian Americans and your experience. What's unique to Chinese, Cambodian, Kazakh American? Let's go. You start, Don. What about this Asian American? Let's talk about it.
Yeah, well, this term, we did not really say, hey, let's get together and have this term. I believe it's one of those constructs of government where they just say, hey, this group of people, let's just, 22 countries, similar area, let's just call them that. Once I will share with you, when we first started Homecrest Community Services, a nonprofit in South Brooklyn, there were two groups, predominant groups. One was Korean, the other one is Chinese. And even with the Chinese group, there are people who speak Mandarin and get Cantonese. But for everyone else outside our community, we all kind of look alike and just assume this is just one center. But in fact, we ended up having to look at the kitchen being set separately because the Korean diet is very different from the Chinese diet, and also language. So we end up running almost three different separate programs within our own center. But for everybody else, we're just one group. And that's just one center in Brooklyn with two different ethnicity, 3 dialects.
Yeah.
It's a complex situation.
22 countries, people. 22. So Jaya, tell us a little bit about your experience in this term, Asian American, and the diversity of Asian Americans.
Very diverse, like Don says. And my experience has always been that Asian American has not served me as a Cambodian American person here in the United States, and because it really erases my community's experience. But I would say that historically it was used to build political power, and it was inspired by the Black Power movement, right? And so this was an attempt in the 60s to do that, for us to be a political power, because together we were stronger, together we were united, and that was the intent of this term. And so, not that it's not useful. I think we have used it when we want to talk about, what it means to get resources in our community, and that actually our Asian numbers are larger. But, for my community, for example, the Cambodian Vietnamese refugee community in the Bronx, we're probably the smallest community, Asian community, where the largest Southeast Asian population is in the Bronx. And so I feel like that term, the intent of it was to build political power. And at that time in the 60s, it made so much sense, right? And so for us, it's not about the erasure of the term now, but I think it's the disaggregation of data that we really want folks to really, and our elected officials and other people to talk and think about when we think about Asian America. And sometimes inclusiveness becomes erasure. And so, and we've experienced that in the Bronx with like our community, because we didn't have any data, therefore our problems didn't exist and we didn't exist. So I want to say that there is power to that word, and there's history rooted in, the liberation of our people and the political power that was needed to shift what this country was going through in the civil rights movement. But it has since changed. And so people like myself who came as refugees are changing those discussions and narrative and what it means to be Asian American in this country at this moment, particularly.
Mm-hmm. So it's about power. I get it. That's a good observation. But what about you, Seon? What does this term Asian American mean to you in your experience? And, is this a term that what we call Asian Americans would actually use?
Well, I think that the term Asian American is definitely an American construct. Outside of America, there's no Asian, nobody grouped themselves as if like somehow we all have so much commonalities. Actually, we have a lot more differences. We are just different people, different culture, different food. And, that's what made New York City so interesting, right? We have this huge population of different people coming from all over the world, providing all that cuisine. So I think, I, as a first generation Chinese immigrant living in America, I only really came to know the need to understand the term Asian Americans when I went to college. I always identify myself as Chinese and immigrant. And obviously, American since I came here when I was very young, when I was 11 years old. And when I was in college, I saw the film Who Killed Vincent Chin, and that was really a shocking experience for a young person to see that, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is not available to all. And Asians are included in this race system that is so much based on race. And the idea of scapegoating, and which I learned in college, studying the Asian American history, I understood the place of Asians in the American racist, system. And you know, it's I think that for many Asians, we only and just people in general, right, growing up in the U.S., you don't really get a diverse education, an education that really help you understand the people and the world and why things happen the way they do. And only when you go to college and consciously want to learn and seek that information. So yeah, so so that's my growing up and understanding Asian American. It is definitely, like Chia said, it was the term Asian American was coined by a historian, Yuji Ichioka, in 1968 when he was founding the Asian American Political Alliance, really to form the Pan-Asian political power so that there is some representation in the American political system.
So, power, politics. However, as you just said, is diverse, and we don't teach it. We just like to lump people because, you know, in America, we get lazy. It's all easier. So, Demi, tell us about your experience or lack of experience as an Asian American from Kazakhstan.
So I would agree with Seon that the term Asian American is a very, very American construct because it aims to merge a whole bunch of people with absolutely different cultural backgrounds into one pot. And as a Kazakh immigrant who came here, I identify as Asian. Every time I got to fill out a census or a DMV, anywhere where I got to fill out my race, the definition of Asian doesn't include my ethnicity. So what people tell me to put in the census or a DMV or whatever is white, which obviously I'm not. And it just deprives me of the opportunity to identify with what I am. It misidentifies me. And you can't tell me I'm white when I'm being called COVID on the street.
Well, you know, this happens to people of color. But, you know, Demi, I didn't know you was like a special white girl. Sometimes you might have to use that, girl. You know, use it unless you lose it. So finally, Stephen, you know, Mr. NYPD man, you know, Asian American, is it helpful? Is this a term that people should be using out of your experience? And as folks said, we're going to get to history here. You know, I've heard that some folks that we think of as Asian Americans really don't like that term. So have you heard that? And what has been your experience with that term and you know, just identifying as Asian?
I find it a little offensive. Like, I think we're all American, right? Why do we have to be Asian American or African American? You know, even like my daughter said to me once, like when I told her that she's Asian, right? At that time I didn't get it, and she was like, "No, Dad, I'm American." And yeah, so you know, I try to say, "But you're Asian American." She's like, "No, why do I have to be Asian American? Why can't I just be American?" You know. But I get the political politics of it, you know, to give us a voice and for us to, you know, come together as a group and to get, I guess, more resources and have a voice. But I mean, at the end of the day, I see us all as humans, you know, like there's no point of Asian American on African American, you know, or Hispanic, so forth and so on. So yeah, I find it kind of offensive, to be honest.
Well, I think as a so-called African American, on my birth certificate, when I was born in Florida, you know, way back in ancient times. My birth certificate says I'm colored. And then I became a Negro. And then I became an Afro-American. And then I became an African-American. And then I just became Black. But you mentioned the education system and the fact that what we refer to as Asians come from 22 countries. It's culture, you know, it's food, it's tradition, it's art, it's dress, it's architecture, it's all of those things. And for me, as a Black woman, because I just might as well just go with it, it used to piss me off when people would say, oh, I don't see color. We're all, no, we're not all the same. We're just not, okay? And if you don't see me, you don't see my race, my ethnicity. But I think that part of that is because here we are, the richest country in the world, and we have one of the worst education systems in the world. If we are not teaching people that, you know, there's Kazakhs, and there's Cambodians, and there's Vietnamese, and there's Koreans, and there's Chinese, and there's all of these other ethnicities that may have come out of some part of Asia. And again, who made the maps? You know, who drew these lines? But I think a lot of this comes out of history. So let's talk a little bit about history. Some of it's taught and some of it isn't taught. Some of it's communication. You know, some of our country's first anti-immigrant, in the broad term, was the Chinese Exclusion Act. And I don't think they really meant Chinese. They just meant anyone that they could stereotype as Asian looking. We interned Japanese. You know, we would not have an intercontinental railroad system without our Asian American brothers and sisters. So let's talk a little bit about history in the United States and how that may have affected you. Anyone? I'm opening this up.
Well, I just want to say that, like, when I was in college or in public school system, I didn't learn anything about Asian history. And I had to learn all that from my parents, from my relatives, from my friends, do my own research. And, you know, I wish that it was just taught more, like, you know, it was a curriculum period, so we could learn about each other's cultures more and understand each other more. You know, that's...
Seon?
Okay, I think that American history is so lacking in truth because, you know, there's just, my kids have 2 kids. They're both now in high school, but they learned American history from kindergarten to 8th grade. And for 200 years of history, that's all they learned. What about world history? And the history that they learned is not even, like, in my view, comprehensive. You know, because their own history is not included. The Chinese are the oldest new immigrants. The Chinese were here in the 1840s, right? For the gold mountain that the Chinese were attracted to come here to do, which is to dig gold. And they ended up building the railroads because there really weren't that much gold. And many died. And were they even recognized for their building the transcontinental railroad? They did the hardest section of the railroad, and so many died. Yet they didn't even appear on the photo when that was commemorated, when the 2 the parts of the railroad met. That history is not there. The Korean War, Vietnam War, Americans going into different countries. How much is it taught? Just the presence of, even for, African Americans, right? The people coming from the Caribbean. What is the history there? What's the experience there? The history that we are seeing our children learn are just so lacking in truth. Real American history is not being taught.
So I just want to, I'm here. My great-grandfather came to this country. And then because the Chinese Exclusion Act, he was not allowed to bring his rest of the family here. So then he went back to China, right? Got married, had my dad. My grandfather came back to the United States. My grandfather came and the same thing happened again. And, my grandfather went back to China, married my grandmother, and then came back to the United States. My dad did not get to meet his father until he was 50 years old.
Oh my God. Oh,
You know
Jesus.
what? It is not unique to me. I've been helping two nonprofit, we have two senior centers. Many seniors in that generation did not get to see their father and their parents until 40, 50 years later. That's pervasive. And, just on the previous point that you made about Asian American, I think I got to give credit to our great Mayor David Dinkins, who said, we're a gorgeous mosaic. Recognize who we are. We're not all blended into one gobbly group, but we are individual pieces of this gorgeous mosaic. And I think he got it the best description of how we should look at the diversity. We contribute to this gorgeous mosaic.
Well, everybody's talking about, blaming Donald Trump for the rise of Asian hate, but Deme and Jaya, it didn't start there. What's going on with it rising up now?
Ademi, you want to go first?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Well, Trump definitely exacerbated the situation, but it was already there. In Asian American history, well, first, Asians were seen as, those opiate addicts who are lazy and don't do work or whatever. And then when the Cold War hit, when they needed those countries to support them, they're like, oh, look at them. They're so smart. They're the model minority.
There you go.
And I just don't see why. And, I want to bring out the previous points Ian did in terms of American history. I have two siblings who are going to junior high school. They're learning American history, and, they're not learning much. They're not learning about Asian American history. They're not learning about African American history. They skip over Malcolm X. They skip over Muhammad Ali. They skip over all of those figures that are so important, but they skip over it. And they don't dig deep into Martin Luther King. They just assume Martin Luther King came there and everything got fixed. No, that's not what happened. And, part of the problem is that the ways in which Asian Americans, the ways in which African Americans and minorities generally have been excluded from society, from middle class, from any law that was passed in American history that was supposed to benefit the mass, but on the basis of race excluded minorities. I think that should be taught in order to understand what each of us are going through.
Well, okay. Here's a conundrum. How the hell, and any of you can answer this, how the hell you get from lazy and devious and evil and tricky to being a model minority? And what the hell is a model minority? what is, let's talk about that idea. Was it because of the Cold War? Is that when it happened? I mean, just like hate didn't just happen with Trump. I mean, everybody, there's really this notion. I don't know what you guys think, and I don't know if it was your experience, Stephen, or yours, Jaya, or what, do you feel, any of you feel like a model minority?
Well, I have to say, let's, talking about education and history, the term model minority actually came about in the 1960s. It's actually written in an article by a professor at the University of California. It's a sociologist, William Patterson. And he wrote it for the New York Times Magazine. And he really cited a mixed history of statistics on education, crime, life expectancy. And he wrote all this to say Asians sort of became exceptional. And why was that so significant, right? Because we just had the Japanese internment camp. We just sort of ended the struggle of the Chinese to get rid of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And all of a sudden the Chinese became exceptional. Why? Remember, put it in the history of American history, there was the great migration from the African Americans, the blacks, people were moving from the south to the north, to the industrial cities. And now you have the white working class not just dealing with the Asians who ended up in big cities for the work. They're not going south, right? There's no work there. So now you have all these, you have the blacks. And now what do? I believe from the get-go, the concept of model minority is about divide and conquer. You pit one minority group against another, and you let them fight this little pie that you give them, right? And we're still doing it today. We're still falling into this trap of divide and conquer, use up all this energy on this tiny little pie instead of spending our energy to expand the pie that we deserve.
I think she hit it right on the butt. Like, the whole model minority, I think, is white America trying to play like the whole I'm not racist, and so look, I have, minority friends, right? So like, where some people say, oh, I'm not racist against, African Americans, I have a black friend. That doesn't mean anything, right? And that's the whole thing about it. It's, they're trying to seem like they're not racist, but they're being racist. And then they end up using us because they feel that at that time we were keeping our head down, keeping quiet, and we didn't make fuss about it. We went about our own business. And so they saw us as easy to control. Right, and that's why they chose, us. And I think we need to snap out of that whole model minority mentality, and raise your voices, So like right now, they're also saying that we're lateral to white people. Like I see myself as a person of color, like I never see myself as a person that's lateral to white. I'm a minority. I'll always be seen as an immigrant, even on job as an NYPD, even though, like, I'm born and raised in Brooklyn. People always looking at me as a, immigrant. I'm 6'4", and the first thing they say is, "Oh, how come you're so tall?" And it's like, what does that mean? Like, I'm supposed to be short because I'm Asian? Like it does. It's just, there's so many ignorance out there, and we need to snap out of it. So.
And I think it's important to know that this whole divide and conquer thing with Asian is that when you're such a model minority, you don't need resources. And that's one thing that our community is suffering. Mm-hmm. Asian in New York City has the highest poverty rate, not Black, not Latinos. I mean, not very far. I think the Asians are 26% and Blacks maybe 25 or 24%. But yet, if you look around, Asians are not getting the services and the resources because there's this model minority, I think, myth, and we're all suffering from that, right? And then when the Asians are, you see a huge number of Asians going to specialized high schools, then there's the sense, right, the whole model minority myth. The African Americans and Latinos are saying, hey, why are Asians getting special preferences and advantages? And that concept is not new. It's kind of old. That's why when that issue came up, it was very easy for those communities to latch onto it, because that whole model minority myth is so deeply ingrained in people's psyche. And I think there has been a moving away of, but because of that, it's very hard to see the actual fact. And it takes so much energy to sort of sort through all those facts so that we all can actually evaluate what's happening. And that little pie that minorities are fighting to get, which is a better education.
I think it's time to just toss that term out, because it came from the 60s, during the time even before the Civil Rights Acts and everything else. So we can imagine where it's coming from, right? If you look at the history, they basically said, look, we just drag all the Japanese out, give them 6 hours to pack. Some of them lose 90% of their property and savings, put them in a concentration camp across the United States, or toss them out to Mexico, some of them, right? Get them across the border. And then, they're still here. And they're doing much better. So that's really, can you imagine someone, a white family or any family who have 3 children, and they go home one day and it says, this one is the model. That means the other 2 are not. So
well, wait a minute.
Right?
They said that, wasps. Then they used to be them.
Right. So, I mean, the point is, they said, hey, it's not so much giving Asian the label as being a model minority. It's really attacking all the other groups, saying you are not. And I think for that reason, all of us should say, hey, stop with that. Enough already. Right? It should die the same way as tube TVs and rotary phones. Right? It should just go away. I think keep bringing it up, only continue. We should be saying how racist it is to come up with that term. That's what we should remember it for. All the other explanation, I think we give it too much energy to talk about it. It does not deserve our time. I think to recognize that this is a racist term that's used to basically say all the other people are bad without saying it. All right, this is a good group. Look what they did. We dragged them out, dragged their ass out, give them 6 hours, put them in jail. All the Chinese kicked them out. Can't bring that woman here. Can't have a family. Yet they did okay. Really? Are they doing okay? All these guys washing people's laundry, washing hand laundry, people cooking food for other people at the lowest cost. Is that the model? Really? I would like to see some people, if that's the model minority, then I don't know what the dream is.
I got you. Well, I mean, I think it is about actually, as Stephen had said, like, you can't be silent about this stuff, because, there was a flashpoint in which that whole specialized high school, Chaya, I mean, that was just, a nightmare. And I got involved back in the 90s about how Black children were tracked, and you couldn't get from Bed-Stuy to Stuyvesant. And at that time, the majority of those students were white, but we know how they got there. Okay? It wasn't like, oh, you're just a genius. They might send their kids to begin with on the Upper East Side or wherever, or they would find a way to get out of their zone and send their kids to this school so that they would go. And once they were going to go to junior high school, they would go to a private school. So, boom, I'm in Stuyvesant, I'm in Bronx Tech. But that whole flashpoint, this city was torn apart. And that there was a real clash between Black people, African Americans, and Asians. And, you know, I don't know if you have heard of, and, you know, all of you, you know, be honest and say, if you've heard within your community, racial bias or derogatory terms for Black people, and if you have heard Black people, you know, have derogatory terms or bias toward Asian. This is a problem, people. So let's talk about that.
So it's a huge problem. And I think this problem, it's man-made. It's manufactured by media. And I'm just going to say it. You know, the parable that says the blind man and the elephant, right? Where four blind men comes in and one touches different part of the elephant and it comes to a different conclusion of what the elephant is. So this is a situation where I think when media only portray African Americans as thugs in movies, and you have immigrant who watch all these media that shows just Black folks being, you know, criminals, right? In a lot of these movies, and they're not exposed to, and that is the only thing that they're going to touch. On the other hand, for the African American community, they're only going to see folks that are doing some restaurants in the local shop, doing whatever, you know, small business, and that is their exposure. And that I think that limited view, right? And what's also common about this group, these are the two groups that are marginalized, the new immigrants that are really just looking to put food on their table, you know, and just get their kids to go by every day. So you're looking at that experience, and as if that is the experience of all Asians, of all African Americans. That's the problem. I think, you know, we talked about earlier, the other panelists about education, but I think beyond education is we need equal time for media to have that responsibility to show that the different facets of our lives, and so that we have a better appreciation and understanding of each other. That is needed.
But we got to deal with this.
We do.
How are we supposed to deal with this? Because I'm telling you, you know, I'm going to give you my experience. I grew up in Philadelphia, and I'm old. So I remember the Vietnam War. My friends were being drafted, okay? And a couple of my friends fled to Canada. And we know that disproportionately, you know, African American boys, Latino boys were disproportionate fighting in Vietnam. Okay? I remember I was alive, awake, and aware when Cambodia was like bombed, and this government lied about it. My parents experienced the Korean War. So growing up in the ghetto in Philadelphia, here was my experience. As Don said, how the hell do these Vietnamese, these Cambodians, come into our neighborhoods and they got the stores and the businesses? How the hell is this Korean market over here? And I don't know if some of you have heard about it, but I lived through it. There were huge clashes between Korean grocers and Vietnamese and Cambodians. I mean, this stuff was real.
Well, Bertha, I agree, and it's that obviously fuels the racial tension, and like the Asian immigrants who came is a very diverse group. There are the poor Chinese, there's poor Cambodian, then there are also the Cambodians who fled but with money, right? They're just, even the group who actually entered the US, even if they're from the same ethnic group, they come from different wealth, right? So from Cambodia and even Vietnam, if you're escaping a war, you could be rich and you could be poor, right? And even for me as Chinese immigrant, my family was poor. My mother worked in a garment factory. My father worked in a fish market, stood all day. I grew up poor. And so I'm, in that group. And going back to the question of this race relations and the Shachet, the specialized high schools, I went to Stuyvesant. I took the test and I got in after 4 years of being here. And would I potentially fit this model minority concept, this whole racist idea? If you just look at it on the outside, yes. But if you look at the education I got when I was in Macau, because my mother hated communism, right? So a lot of people come to the US for different reasons. My mother hated communism. My grandfather came in the 60s from Cuba, where he grew up. And when the door opened up for, Asians to come, Chinese, he was able to come in the 60s. And then, over time, he sponsored all his children here. My mother just took the opportunity right away because she just, did not like communism. So, I was educated in my early education was in math, was so much stronger in China, Macau, than the US. I came here in the 4th grade. I was doing 6th grade math, right? So I, kept on with that. And when I took the exam, obviously math wasn't as big of a challenge. English was. And I really just have to focus on the English, the math I could do. But if you are talking about, so you see a lot of actually poor immigrants, of Asian descent, who are in Stuyvesant or Brown Science or Brooklyn Tech, because half the tests we could handle, right? Now, if you grew up as Latinos and Blacks, well, you have the lack of resources, limited education. So in my view, the current, fight over the Shachet test, I don't think it would solve the problem of parents and people in general wanting their kids to have a better life by having a better education, right? If the idea is a better life and a better education, then we need to start fighting for resources at kindergarten. It should not start at this test because it's already too late. If all the energy is spent on fighting over this test, then it's divide and conquer done.
I came home from an anti-Asian hate rally. My super, who is a Black guy, but I think he's got some like Hispanic in his background or something. And I had the posters from the rally, that said, "I am not a virus, stop Asian hate." And when I told him where I was coming from, he went off. He was like, F them. They never did anything for us. They never came out for us. Why should we come out for them? This is, a visceral thing. So what do we do about that, y'all?
But I hear you. It's just like when I came home.
Listen, in the NYPD, there's dark blue and there's light blue. Okay?
Yeah.
They think Demi's white. What the hell?
In NYPD.
People don't even talk about Vietnamese or Cambodians anymore, Jaya. But there is this divide with Black folks. What are we gonna do? Because this country pretty soon it's going to be a new majority. Now, how are we going to deal with that, y'all? Y'all have to help me. How are we going
I
to?
think we gotta look at the history. Like my people are here, Cambodians and Vietnamese are here because the U.S. was over there and sent many, many Black folks and colored people to fight in the front. And when we were in refugee camps, guess who we saw? White saviors, white people coming to save us, and in the front line were all Black and brown people killing us. And then we were resettled already in marginalized communities. So my America is Black America, and like folks always, like I grew up, being fed by Black women because my parents were working all the time, and it was Black women who really took care of me. And I think that's the thing. Like as Asian American, like we have to understand the history of this country, but also our relationship to this country as countries, right? So Cambodia, Vietnam, like it was a war in Southeast Asia, and here we are, and even the fight for our liberation and our life was actually fought by civil rights activists, particularly Bayard Rustin, who fought for us, who actually went and took our stories in the refugee camps to say they should be resettled because America didn't want us here. There may have been some moral consciences, and honestly, America didn't want our Black and brown people to come back either. So when they were saying we want our people back home, it wasn't them, And so I come to this country knowing rightfully that the history of this country is rooted in anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity. And so our work within like the Cambodian Vietnamese community is about saying, hey, like we need to build Black and Southeast Asian solidarity. What does that look like? And it means like we really have to fight like our life dependent on it. And like if we're fighting for our liberation, we're gonna have to fight for Black liberation, because this country is rooted in white supremacy. It is rooted in anti-Blackness. Anti-Asian exists because of anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity in this country. And so I get really pissed because like this whole thing around like we're the freaking myth, it's like, and every day you have to fight that, and we're fighting for 600 students versus an entire Board of Education system of thousands that the education system has failed us. And so our conversation has to also change. And we shouldn't be talking about those schools because it's 600 people versus 600 children versus thousands. And I'm a failure of that. And my people are failures of the Board of Education system and so many other marginalized community, Black and brown community. And so when I think about my liberation, I think about the liberation of Black people and what it means for me to center my people and at the same time center Black and Indigenous people in this country. So that's sort of like how like Mekong came to be, and like that's what we teach in Mekong and my kids, to understand that the real enemy, or like who really we have a problem with, is actually white supremacy, and so and that means that we have to look at everything systemically. Like we're an anti-violence organization before we started talking about anti-Asian violence, and the deportations of Cambodians is the anti-Asian violent issue. The murder of the 6 Asian women, that's anti-Asian violence, rooted in white supremacy, patriarchy, and so we're going to have to name all the systems because it can easily become these acts of individuals, right? And so we have to remind ourselves in our own history of the fights for Black liberation and how this country grew, and how, of the labor of the Chinese, the Asians, the Filipinos, the folks that continue to be excluded, continue to be the other. And if we continue to believe in that, like you said, there's no way in like us changing the generations to come, because we're dealing with multi-generational oppression and and work that needs to be. So this is a lifelong commitment for me in the social justice movement, and I know that it is for most of us in this call probably too.
But it's also, to answer your question directly, about how did this Korean own these shops and everything else. I think something that we need to really engage the community to really talk about it, right? To really share that experience. The reason why they you know, folks only see the one that survived. I got to see the one that don't make it. People put their lives. I'm not saying, they put everything they got. When I was in college, just the time when this Korean shops opened up, I talked to one of my Korean, I'm Chinese, I don't know about the Korean culture. I said, how do you guys open 24 hours? It's as simple. It takes 4 hours to set up, 4 hours to put it away, 4 hours to set up. So instead of doing the 8 hours doing no economic value, we might as well open up for that extra 8 hours. And that's how they became 24-hour shops around, not just all over the country, right? So it's hardship. But those are the one that people see are the one that make it. The one at another talk, I would love to share with people the people who don't make it, even though they put in all those hours. My father is one of those people that, did everything you're supposed to do. And when he died, I have to come up with how to bury him. And he said to me, Don, I consider myself success because I'm able to get you the education. I get to this country only to make sure that you have a fair shot at life to get you an education. That's my motivation for my dad, right? So I think that it's important for folks to understand and the struggles. I mean, I also are fortunate enough to grow up in a very diverse community, work for a couple of mayors and meet a lot of people that there are a lot of stories that are not told, right? So we are in the 60s, we talk about this whole thing about the model minority myth, but everyone talk about Judge William Mauritani, who rode the Freedom Bus through the South in the 1960s, because he worked as a houseboy and he too was pissed off and tired of being called boy by everyone. So he actually wrote, but how many people know about that? Like the story, I hold a sign when Eric Garner was choked to death. I hold a sign that says, I can't breathe. People come and said to me, Don, why are you holding this sign? We got robbed by these folks. If they follow what the cops are telling them, they'd be okay, right? But again, there's a lot of things that we need to talk about. And until we got to understand each other, to really not just, but we ended up having so much time on these old history stuff that we're not talking about what's happening current now, right? So I get one more example, I'll turn to the other panelists. Wen Ho Lee, there are about 5 or 6, there's a research, a white paper that have written out that Chinese scientists, Asian scientists are more likely to be charged with espionage or spying against this country than any other groups, right? So I can name you, how many people know Wen Ho Lee? How many name Shirley Chen? These are folks who were actually literally grabbed from their home, tossed in jail, denied bail because they are charged with spying against the United States. All the charges were dropped ultimately. So we all have different problems. We got to fight the system, not each other.
Exactly. And I just want to add to that what we should first and foremost stop doing is judging the entire community based on one person. So there can be an Asian American person who says, I don't believe in Black Lives Matter, or an African American person says Asian hate doesn't exist. And then what a lot of Asians do, they're like, oh, they don't support us. The whole community doesn't support us. So what our obligation as Asian Americans, what my obligation as an Asian American woman is to attend as many Black Lives Matter protests as I can to show I support Black people. I support minorities. Our only issue, we have a common issue, is white supremacy. It is eating us. It is pitting us against each other, and that is the problem.
Yeah. Another answer to your question is, how do we solve this? Is more dialect, communication, educating each other on our histories, educating each other on our feelings, on our fears, and just get to know each other. Growing up, like I grew up in Flatbush, and a lot of my friends were West Indians, and they at first didn't accept me. They like make fun of me and stuff like that. But then once they got to know me, they're like, oh, he raps and stuff like that, and he's like one of us. He listens to hip hop, or he plays basketball, and they were like, oh, you're cool, for an Asian guy, you're cool. I took that kind of offensive, but like they accepted me. And then, once they accepted me, I become part of the family. And when other, new people meet me, they vouch for me. You know, they'll be like, nah, he's cool. You know, and that's what we need to do. We need to open up a dialect. We need to get, educate each other on each other, and let people know, like, we're just the same. We all bleed red, right? We're all one blood, and we just need to let people know that. Is stop falling into that white supremacy, that systematic divide, where they're trying to divide us, because they know if we come together, we're strong, right? If we come together, we're a fist, and we could fight. And that's what they're scared of. That's what they don't want, because then they start to lose power.
Yeah, I think that I agree with what everyone said. I feel that we can really cherish more about our common struggles and our historical bonds. There is so much that we don't know about because we don't learn about it. And what's not recorded never happened. For instance, there were farm worker strikes back in the 40s or 50s. The Filipinos decided to go on strike, and the white farmers decided to bring the Latinos in to break the strike. And then the leaders of the Filipino workers met with Cesar Chavez, which is a lot more sophisticated, and convinced him that they should join together and don't break the strike. So those historical evidence that there is so much more in common among all of us who are minorities are, most of us are really just striving to have a better life. I think if we learn more about our common history, our common struggles, and really understand how white supremacy works, that it's not just something that is commonly thrown around. It's like there is actual evidence of it. And that's also for people who are not minorities, who are actually white. There would not have been the advancement in the fight against racism if we don't have allies from those people who are white and benefit from it. They are the people who see themselves first as human before they are the beneficiary of the system. And we have to continue to recognize that and not alienate people who are actually just really are good, and also for ourselves to gain more. I feel knowledge is power, and I think if we don't reform our educational system, in the long run, this is just going to be the same. I want my kids to learn more. I encourage them to read. I read like crazy, to try to understand the world I live in. And I actually decided to go into the arts because there's only so many words. There's only so many times we can talk. And I wanted to go into the subconscious. So I paint, the Asian American experience, through my Canner project. I paint, women, elderly who are in my neighborhood who pick up cans for a living. Now, are they model minorities? They are people trying to survive, right? And I paint ordinary, people, Asians, and who they are, the diversity of our experience. At the end of the day, we're human. We're human first. And I wanted to share that human experience. And I think that in order to fight this injustice that exists in the system now, more through the arts, through conversations, through dialogue, what we really need to see is that common human experience. And then how do we have a more just society from that?
Well, listen, I would not disagree with that. But here's my thing. I'm going to give you something that you will be able to do in a couple of weeks, to get this, Blasian thing together. The Black Institute is having a Juneteenth, June 19th celebration, liberation, reparations, COVID-free, vaccination, barbecue in Queensbridge Park. Put it on your calendars. Juneteenth. That was the day 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation that slaves in Texas got the word. Talk about CP time. So Juneteenth, it's a Saturday, mark it down. I'm depending on you, Stephen, to help us out with your NYPD brothers. I don't know what precinct that is, but, you know, help us out here, you know, and you know, I need some tall police there. The other thing is, we have to do it. White folks have screwed this up. They have pitted us against each other. They hate us all. And it is about power. And I think that as Black Americans, it is our job to teach the history to our children and to other children and to push the system and demand that the education system talk about our Asian brothers and sisters, our Latino brothers and sisters, our indigenous brothers and sisters. It's up to us. It's up to our Asian brothers and sisters to say enough of this Black Asian divide. Let me tell you about me. Here, you know, let me give you some food. And let's all understand, all of us folks who have some melanin in our skin, even the white folks, don't tell them, but all of them got a tick in the woodpile somewhere because you all come out of Africa. So thank you all. This has been great. Gosh, I know everybody has learned so much. We are going to continue this series. Again, please go to our website, order All Races, All Faces, where you can look at the 22 different Asian countries, and you can look at how we put together immigrants from all over the globe and everything. Thank you all for being here. Get All Races, All Faces, and come to the Black Institute's Juneteenth barbecue celebration in Queensbridge Park.
I'll be
All
there.
right, thank you all. We'll see you next time with our next roundtable, in which we'll be talking about LGBTQIA XYZ. Thank you all. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.